let me go back to the first thing in 1968, because it's fascinating that you would say that. I think that 1968, besides the Civil War, is the closest the country ever came to coming apart at the seams. The protests over Vietnam, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the polarization of the country was just incredible. And in many ways stirred up by youth. You know, you millennials, you guys think that this is all about, that you just started all this, but the reality is that the youth movement in this country has spurred many good things to have come out of it. And but 68 was a tough year. I graduated from Trinity University in San Antonio, and I got to Trinity. My father was a reserve pilot in the Air Force and was called up for Korea and died in a training accident. And as a result of that, and some of his friends who somehow followed me, because I was only 5 at the time, I got an appointment to the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy. And in the middle of my senior year, I said to myself, I don't want to do this. It was 1964. And the reason I didn't want to do it, as I look back on it, is I knew that I didn't have the math skills. And I didn't have the math skills. When I took college algebra, I really knew I didn't have the math skills. So I would have flunked out of the academies, because the academies were all engineering back then. There's no way I could have survived. No way. So at the last second, I said to my stepdad, who's a wonderful, dear human being, I said, I don't want to do this. And he said, well, where are you going to go to college? And I said, well, I'll go to right here in Texas Western, now UTEP in El Paso. And he says, no, you won't. And I'll never forget, he says, growing up is going away. And in September, you can be in a college outside of El Paso, which I'll pay for, or you can be in an apartment anywhere you want to be, but you will not be in this house. And I went, oh, I get it. So I was a decent high school tennis player. And at that time, in 1964, Trinity University in San Antonio had the #1 tennis team in the country. The #1 player in the world, #4 or 5 player in the world. I didn't play that caliber of tennis, you know, but I knew about them. So I said, well, I'll go to Trinity. And I went sight unseen. Had never been there, had no concept of it, other than they had a great tennis team. They also had, when I got there, compulsory Army ROTC. So if you were a male, the first 2 years, your freshman and sophomore year, you were in ROTC. Then you made a decision if you wanted to stay in ROTC. So by 1966, when the decision's coming, the war is hot and heavy. So I said, maybe I'll stay in here. And if I'm going to have to go to war, I might as well go as an officer. So I stayed in ROTC, commissioned, went into the infantry, went to this normal schooling that everybody goes to, and then went off to Vietnam in October of '69. And to the end of your question, I found out something about myself. I found out many things about myself, but I found out 2 very big, real things in the jungles of Vietnam, where I was an infantry soldier in direct combat with an enemy. I found out I loved what I was doing. I loved the camaraderie, the challenge of it. I loved it. And I was very good at it. So I said, So I stayed, and as we talked earlier, the rest is history. So here I am. Serendipitous. There were 2 very different worlds, the jungles and the desert. There's no doubt about that. I was a full colonel when I went to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I was a brigade commander. I led the largest, at the time, the largest heliborne assault in warfare history. I went on the first day of the ground war. I flew 90 miles into Iraq, set up a base in Iraq. Very different worlds. The Vietnam War and the Army, and I'll just talk the Army that came out of Vietnam and merged into the 70s, a draftee Army, and then became, when the draft ended, became the early days of the all-volunteer force. In the mid-70s is an Army I refer to as the awful Army. I know of no other word to describe it. We were incapable of doing anything. And those of us who stuck it out through the days of post-draft post-Vietnam, through the ears of the early Army, of the awful Army, and then built it, and took it to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and proved it to be the greatest army the world had ever seen. I mean, they're two different worlds. It's night and day. Night and day. And the young people that comprise the U.S. military, who are all volunteers, are the countries and the world's lucky to have them. So it's very different times. Very different times. Yes. Interesting, they were both in helicopters, and I commanded the brigade that I was a part of in Vietnam. That was cool. I thought that was fun. Yeah. I am, to the best of my knowledge, I'm one of 3 Army generals to ever wear a blue beret working directly for the UN. Tom Montgomery, retired 3-star Montgomery, who did it in Somalia. A guy named Joe Kinzer, 3-star, retired 3-star, named Joe Kinzer, who was my boss in Haiti, and me. We went to Haiti as part of the UN-sponsored force. Under the term is under the auspices of the UN, with the 25th Division in January, and then on April the 1st, part of us went home, part of us reverted to the UN peacekeeping force, and I stayed on as General Kinzer's deputy. Fascinating. I learned a lot about a lot of different things. The UN, if done correctly, UN forces can be very useful in the world. If done incorrectly, they're just a mess. I thought we did some really good work in Haiti, both as the U.S. forces retraining or training a new police force, helping the government get going, working a new judicial system, and then as part of the UN force simply maintaining law and order. It was a fascinating thing. Never been asked that question. That's an interesting question. When I took over in 2002, the United States was beginning to get very focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. We'd already been in Afghanistan. We weren't quite in Iraq yet. What it did for me, it gave me a freedom as a combatant commander that none of the others had, because I was really operating on my own, because the President and the Secretary of Defense and everybody, their focus is really not in Latin America. If you look at Latin America in particular, to the point of your question, we were very concerned about two different things, maybe more than, I'm sure more than that, but one was the drug operation coming out of, in particular, Colombia, and the fact that Colombia was it's not an exaggeration to say that when I took over at Southcom and President Alvaro Uribe took over as president of Colombia within a day or two of me, that Colombia was on the verge of being a failed state. Today it's far from that, and a lot of it is a direct result of what the U.S. effort was in Colombia in response to President Uribe's leadership. I went to Colombia 31 times in 24 months, from everything from one day to a week at a time. I made a point of going at least once a month, and sometimes 2 or 3 times a month. Working with President Uribe, working with their military, working with our embassy, working with our intelligence people to help the Colombians get a handle on their war. The other thing we did was we ran a major drug interdiction operation coming up out of South America and Central America. We also countered Chinese interests and influence in the region, and we, for sure, I think kept a lid on some of the at least watched very carefully some of the money piece of terrorism that goes in and out of Latin America. It's really strange, you know. There's an area on the border between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil that Hezbollah gets a whole lot of money out of.
Never think
Large, you know, nobody does. Large Lebanese trading community down there has been there forever, and there's a huge influx of money that comes out of that region, goes right back into Hezbollah. There is a large Muslim element on a place called Margarita Island, right off the coast of Venezuela, which we watch very carefully, because it's just a money laundering area. That's a very interesting question. I'm pausing just because I want to answer it the right way. My management skill, my management mantra is, and I'm separating that from leadership, management. My management mantra has been since I was a lieutenant colonel, major lieutenant colonel, mid-level guy, I only do those things that only I can do. I only do those things that only I can do. And the higher I went up, the more I began to really understand that. This really senior leader, there are things that only the senior leader can affect and make change on, and everything else is ancillary to that. So you get your focus on the things that only you can do, and then you find somebody else to hold accountable and responsible to do the rest of it. The trick is then letting them do that, and you stay focused on what you can do. I only do those things that only I can do. Leadership's a different issue. There is lots of myth about, well, it's pretty easy to be in the military, you just give an order and it's on. It's easy to give an order. I can give an order. Getting it obeyed and getting it executed correctly are two different issues. And that requires a great deal of leadership. I grew up in a values-based organization, the United States Army, built upon a foundation of trust between the leader and the led, and both have got to trust each other in equal amounts. Both have got to respect each other in equal amounts. I believe firmly and deeply in the dignity of all human beings. And I think that came through in my leadership style and the way I cared for people, because I do care for people. I saw it. I think I did that in Vietnam, and I think I did that all my life. I mean, but it does come down to having an ethic of your own, the values of the organization that you're a part of, and in the Army, living by 7 values: leadership, duty, honor, courage, integrity, respect, and most of all, selfless service, understanding that you're serving something greater than yourself. So you cannot lose sight of that. When right after we went into Iraq, one of the very first soldiers killed in Iraq in Operation Enduring Freedom, OIF, was a Colombian American, wasn't even a citizen yet, killed. His name was Diego Rincon. And I went to his funeral. And I wasn't my soldier, but he was Colombian, and the Chief of Staff of the Army asked me to go up there to the funeral, and I presented the flag to his family. And they had buttons made for him with Specialist Rincon's face on it. And I kept that button on my desk until the day I retired, so that when I looked at it, I always remembered that those are real live people out there that's getting killed. Those are not boots on the ground. I hate that phrase, boots on the ground. Those are human beings. And by the way, you're killing human beings. And any time that a soldier forgets that it's another human against another human, and you begin to dehumanize that, bad things will happen. Not can happen, will happen. So it's important to remember, and unnecessary killing is not right. It's not correct. It's immoral. So I think that gets at your question. Oh, on the same side with those that are endorsing Secretary Clinton. I don't like it. I'm fundamentally against it. I will never endorse anybody. And I've been asked, ever since I've been retired, to endorse. I never endorse. In fact, I'll say to anybody who calls me, I'll be happy to help you write for your candidate papers that make them smarter on national security issues or Latin American issues or whatever. The first time I was asked, right after I retired, was during the President Obama, Senator McCain election. And both sides wanted me to endorse. I said I will not endorse, but I'll be happy to talk with people to help the candidates get smarter. Only the Obama people took me up on it. So I went and had several discussions with people who ended up in the Obama White House, trying to help them understand Latin America affairs. I was asked this year to endorse, and I said I won't do it. I'll be happy to write papers, but I don't endorse. The reality of life is at the highest levels, there is always natural friction between the civilians and the military. It's a natural inclination. Anything that increases that friction is not good. It's not good for the military, it's not good for the country, and these endorsements, even from retired guys, in my opinion, tell the other guy, the incoming person, can cause them to have more distrust for the military. You can't have that. I served through, as you accurately showed, 4 different transitions. I was part as a major. I worked on the transition team from the Army. There was about 10 of us, headed by a 2-star. I was a major at the time, working on the Reagan transition. Then when I came out of the War College, I was the head of the U.S. Army team for the transition with President Bush, Herbert Walker Bush. Then I was, as a 1-star, I was there for the Clinton. I was there as a 1-star in the Joint Staff. I was in the last year of Herbert Walker Bush's tenure and the first year of President Clinton. So I worked that transition on the Joint Staff, and then as a 4-star, I worked the transition also. They're all different, but they all come into, in my opinion, either party, come into the Pentagon thinking that they're going to fix it all, that everything else was messed up before they got there, so they're going to fix it. And then they quickly come up with the idea, then they understand that I take an oath to the Constitution of the United States. I don't take an oath to the President of the United States. There's no mention of the President of the United States in my oath. My oath says I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, period. So we take it, and it's like no other oath in the world. Nobody takes an oath like that, right? We take an oath to defend the rule of law. And when when one president takes over, you salute the new president, and you're doing it. I tell this one story. When I was the 1-star, I was called over the day before President Clinton is inaugurated to the National Security Council, or to the old Executive Office building, to meet my counterpart on the former Yugoslavia was disintegrating all of it. And so this guy was in charge of that for President Bush's part of on the National Security Council. And he talked to me for about 45 minutes, telling me what I was going to do 6 months from now. And I finally looked at him and I said, Dave, I give you guys A for effort, but tomorrow morning I am saluting President Clinton, and we're doing a different policy. So, I mean, please. but that's a very good question. When I wrote that, it was part of my application to come here. And I decided that I wanted to be an IOP fellow after a visit last fall and interaction with the students. And I loved being with the students. I liked the sense of vitality that the students had, and the interaction with them was just, it was a marvelous experience, as has been the last couple of months and will continue to be. But and all the people that have come in and out of the IOP are interested in government for whatever, in one way or another. And they're interested in service, and this was my point, the point that I'd leave with you. In my very first study group, in the first 3 or 4 sentences of my study group, I quote a congressman from Boston named Seth Moulton. Seth Moulton is a Harvard graduate, young man, young congressman, who, in talking with one of your very famous, now deceased chaplains, Peter Gomes, he's talking about trying to figure out some service. And the chaplain Moulton is quoted as saying that Chaplain Gomes taught him to understand that it was not enough to talk about service. You needed to find something to serve, some way to serve. And what I'm trying to do in my interaction with students is to encourage that, to encourage some form of service. It doesn't have to be the military. It doesn't have to be, even in government. But you need to be able to give back to humanity. I carry around in my wallet, and have for years and years and years, 2 things. So I'll leave Harvard students with this. I'll leave, and also gets back to your question about how did you manage doing your professional stuff along with caring for. The first is a quote by a humorist named Leo Roston, and he said, "I cannot believe that the purpose of life is to be happy. I think the purpose of life is to be useful, to be responsible, to be compassionate. It is above all to matter, to count, to stand for something, to have made some difference that you lived it all." I've tried to live my life that way, in a purposefully filled way. This other piece, and if you looked at it carefully, you'd see it's folded in little squares, and before I laminated, I've carried this in my wallet since 1968. And it comes from a Newsweek magazine the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. They issued the edition after him. And every now and then in my life, I've pulled this out of my wallet and read it in moments of despair. And it's a quote by Martin Luther King. And it says, "Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him that it is right." And that's how I've tried to live my life. And so if I was going to leave Harvard students with anything, it's those 2 quotes. Okay?